Welcome, everybody. Let's have a look at our Mishnah for today. We are in the third chapter of Pirkei Avos. Today we're going to learn Mishnah number 9. And what's interesting about this Mishnah is possibly even more interesting than the content is the personality. So that's actually where we're going to start. We're going to start with the personality, the man behind this Mishnah. And once we've done that, then of course we can have a look at what it is that he has to teach. And I'll tell you something interesting. The rabbi that we're about to meet is very well known. Very well known. And yet, ironically, he's not very well known for his teachings. This Mishnah may in fact be the one teaching that we have from this particular rabbi. So, if he's not known for his teachings, what's he known for? I mean, we're talking about the Talmudic era. We're talking about the greatest personalities of Jewish history. We're talking about people who shaped our thinking, who shaped our laws, who shaped our philosophy as Jews. Obviously, if you're famous in that period of time, you must be famous for your teaching, right? For your Torah. So what is it that made this individual so famous if it's not his teachings? Well, let's first meet the rabbi, and once we know who we're talking about, maybe it makes it a little bit easier to find out what it is that we need to know about him. So who is the hero of our Mishnah today? Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa. That's his name. Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, the Gemara later, in a different place, is going to tell us that when Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa passed away, it's a whole discussion that the Talmud has about various personalities and how when each of these personalities passed away, there was a particular loss. Something in the Jewish world fell to pieces when this particular individual passed away. So when the Talmud tells us about Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, it says when he died, Pasku Anshe Maise. That was the end of the period of people who had these incredible stories as part of their lives. That's what Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa is most well known for. Not so much for his teaching, not to say that he wasn't a scholar. We'll discuss that during the course of this Mishnah. I'd also like to just draw your attention to the fact that it's not just this Mishnah, it's this Mishnah and the next Mishnah, both of which are attributed to Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa. And we'll see, as we often do in Pirkei Avos, we'll see elements of his life and what he represents emerging in his words. So what is Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa most well known for? Maise, from the incredible stories that happened to him during the course of his lifetime. And there really are incredible stories. As I said, that's why the Gemara tells us that when he passed away, that was the end of people who had these amazing stories happen to them. First of all, a little bit of context, not so surprising, that you find out Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa was a person who had very serious financial challenges. That's not altogether unusual, I'm afraid to say, for rabbis, generally. And wasn't altogether unusual for rabbis of the Talmudic era, as much as we look to them as the great sages. Many of them suffered financially. They battled. And so Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa was one of those individuals. Just to contextualize him, Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa is a student of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. You'll remember from the previous chapter that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 outstanding students, each of whom then taught us pretty much the second half of the second chapter. So Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa might have been a little bit overlooked at that point, but he's also one of the students of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Talmud tells us very interesting stories about Rabbi Chanina, firstly in the context of his finances, and then in the context of other things that happened to him in his life. Here's one. Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa was so poor that there were times they didn't have anything to eat for Shabbos. In fact, the Gemara makes a very powerful statement. The Gemara says that Hashem himself says, the entire world is worth having for one, in fact, the wording that the Gemara uses is, my son, Chanina ben Doisa. That's the term of endearment that Hashem used about him. It is worthwhile to have a world just for one Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa. And then the Gemara continues, who is able to survive from 1 week to the next with a bag full of carobs. As if to say he didn't have much else. That's how he lived. And so it was that there were certain occasions where they really didn't have what they needed. One classic example, the Gemara tells us the story that it was Friday and they had nothing to serve for Shabbos. And his wife was very self-conscious. You know, everybody else is baking and cooking, and there's the smell coming from people's homes, and you could see the smoke in their ovens. and she had nothing to produce. So to save face, she gathered some twigs and she put them in the oven, so at least it should produce smoke and give the impression that she was able to cook for Shabbos. As you can imagine, it was very humiliating for her. Dafka, as it would happen, she had a neighbor who was a little bit of a nasty personality. And the neighbor knew that they didn't have money. And rather than, of course, assist them, the neighbor looked to, as we say in Yiddish, to ziddle, to give them a little bit of tzoros. And so she waited and she saw the smoke coming out of the oven. So she barged in unannounced into the house to see what was cooking. Well, Rabbi Hanina's wife was so embarrassed, she ran for cover, hid somewhere in the back of the house. And this woman went and opened up the oven. And you can imagine Rabbi Hanina's wife was devastated. She's going to see that what's in the oven is just twigs to create the impression, the illusion of them having food. This woman opens the oven, and the next thing she yells out, she says, "Quick, quick, come, your challahs are going to burn." And Rabbi Hanina's wife was completely perplexed. She emerged from her hiding place, and sure enough, miraculously, the oven was filled with challahs. And that's the kind of life that Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa lived. This unusual life of incredible miracles that just were par for the course for them. On another occasion, they had no money, and his daughter came to him and said, "We need to light Shabbos candles, and we don't have any olive oil." That was the classic way that they would light Shabbos candles. So, we don't have any olive oil. What should we do? So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, "Use vinegar." She says, "Vinegar? How on earth are you supposed to light your Shabbos candles with vinegar?" So Rabbi Hanina said, "The same God who decreed that oil should ignite can equally decree that vinegar should ignite." And credit to his daughter, she took it at face value, and she went and she lit. She and the mother, and they lit vinegar that Shabbos, and it lit, and it worked. So that's Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. He had these incredible experiences, otherworldly experiences. There were occasions that the rabbis approached him to daven on their behalf. It's very interesting because we have a general principle which says, in fact, you actually see this in the Yom Kippur davening, that there's one prayer that we ask Hashem to please ignore. It's a bit funny, right? How do you ask Hashem to ignore a prayer? There's one prayer that we ask Hashem to ignore. What is that? The prayers of travelers who wish for it not to rain. Because rain is important, and without rain, nobody can survive. But of course, you know how it is. The person doesn't want to be out caught in the rain, traveling through the mud. So it's clear that we say you don't. In fact, that's the reason why we only start to ask for rain. We're saying Talmud Matar only a while after Shmini Atzeres. We want to give people the chance to get home from having made pilgrimage to the Beis Hamikdash. So we don't want to start asking for rain when people are on the road, and equally we don't want people to daven that there should be no rain because they have to travel. There's one exception. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was once traveling on the road, and it began to rain. And Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa said, "Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, is it appropriate that the whole world should be happy, obviously because it's raining, and your servant Hanina should be upset because he's on the road?" So it stopped raining. When he got home, he said, "Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, does it make any sense that Hanina, your servant, should be happy and everybody else should be upset?" So it began to rain. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an insight into what kind of a personality we're dealing with. Possibly one of the most intriguing stories that we have about Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is that it eventually reached boiling point. The poverty in his home was too much for his wife to bear. And she said, "Please, you have to do something." And this is relevant to our conversation and our Mishnah today. She said, "Rabbi Hanina, look how your prayers are answered." We've just used an illustration, right? You pray for it to stop raining and it stops. You turn on the weather at will. You need to pray to Hashem to help us out, that we should be able to live. So he took his wife's word very seriously and he davened. And sure enough, later that week, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is on his way home or wherever he was, and lying literally on the side of the road was a bar of gold. Literally. A very unusually shaped bar of gold. So Rabbi Hanina was very pleased he could come home, and of course his wife would be most happy to see this. And so he brings home this piece of gold, and she's over the moon. This is it. Their problems are solved. They'll never worry about money ever again. And they have to just work out, how they're going to plan it and how they're going to sell the gold or whatever they're going to do with it. That night, Rabbi Chanina's wife has a dream. And in the dream, she is in what they call the Yeshiva Shel Maila, the supernal academy of Jewish studies in Gan Eden. And she's walking around, she sees all these great scholars, some of whom she had met through her husband, some of whom had passed on in previous generations. And they're sitting there and they're learning, and it's the most exquisite experience of spirituality. And every single one of them sits at a golden table. And the golden table has 4 legs. And then she sees that there's a table that's allocated. It says that it's allocated for Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, and it only has 3 legs. And she straight away was able to recognize that the shape of the strange golden cylinder that they had found was actually one of these table legs. He wakes up the next morning. She says to Rabbi Chanina, just as hard as you daven for them to give us the gold, please daven that they should take it back. And that's what he did. His wife asked him to daven, so he davened. And sure enough, we don't know the details of exactly how, but sure enough, the gold table leg disappeared from this physical realm and I guess was reunited with the table up on high. The Gemara comments on that story. Fascinating comment. The Gemara comments that this is one of the most powerful prayers ever said in history. Why? Because from Shamayim, from heaven, it is natural for them to give. It is not natural for them to take away what they have already given. So the kind of prayer that is that powerful, that could get somebody to convince, so to speak, Shamayim, convince Hashem to take away what he'd already given us, that's a very powerful form of prayer. So by this point, you should be able to see the developing theme over here. Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa is most well known for the supernatural events of his life, and he is most well known for his unique prayer, his ability to daven in an unprecedented way. And that's going to be relevant to our conversation today and what we're going to learn. It's also going to be relevant to the next Mishnah, which please God we'll do next week. But for today, the idea of Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa being this expert, this professional when it comes to prayer, speaks volumes in terms of what it is that we're going to learn. So let's see what Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa has to teach us. Just a little bit of context is that the previous Mishnah, if you remember, the previous Mishnah spoke about the fact that you have to be really careful to ensure that you don't forget your Torah learning. That's where we've just come from. There's always a flow between the Mishnahs. So the previous Mishnah said, whatever you do, make sure that you don't forget your learning, because it's a very serious offense and potentially even, God forbid, taking one's life in one's own hands if a person forgets their learning. So bear that in mind, because it will be relevant to our conversation over here today. So what does today's Mishnah teach us? Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa Oimer, Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa says, Kol sheyiras chetoi koidemes lechachmasoi. Any person whose fear of sin precedes their wisdom, then chachmasoi miskayemes. Such wisdom will endure. So do you see the link to the previous Mishnah? The previous Mishnah said that you have to make sure that you retain your wisdom, that you don't learn the wisdom, that you don't forget the wisdom that you've acquired. So we understand now how serious it is from the previous Mishnah. We need a technique, we need a strategy. What do you do to ensure that you don't forget what you've learned? Comes Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, says, I'll tell you. If yiras chetoi, if fear of sin, or if you want to be very specific and translate directly, if fear of your sin, koidemes lechachmasoi, precedes your wisdom, then chachmasoi miskayemes, then your wisdom is going to endure. It's very interesting to note that we have different words in Hebrew to represent different kinds of sin. So here we've just translated generically as sin, right? But if we had to put it together, we have a good few words, right? We have aveira, we have avoin, we have pesha. You could even say avla. We have various words that represent sin, and then we have the word chet. Now, what's interesting about them is that each word represents a different style of sin. Isn't that nice? I guess that's one of the great things about being Jewish. We have different styles of sinning. It's not that, it's not that simple and straightforward. You just either do good or do bad. Oh no, we've got professionals, There's this kind of sin and there's that kind of sin. So, for example, the word avera comes from the word la'avor. In English, we translate it as a transgression, because that's what it is. You've crossed over. So a person is meant to be on one side of the tracks. A person is meant to be in a headspace of dedication to Hashem. Avera would mean that they've crossed over to the other side of the tracks, rejection of Hashem. So that's pretty serious. Pesha is even more serious, because pesha means that you did so deliberately, rebelliously. A poshea is somebody who wants to do something which is toxic. So that's really bad. On the other extreme, the word chet implies not necessarily even a sin. There are, for example, there's the pasuk that says, "V'chiyeh beish chet mishpat maves v'humas." If a person will have a sin that deserves the death penalty, and then they'll be put to death, then v'solisa oisoy al eitz, then after the Beis Din has executed the person, they have to temporarily suspend his body on a tall pole, like as a public statement. Look what happens when a person goes so terribly against the Torah. Now, when Reb Chaim Vital, I think it was Reb Chaim Vital passed away, so the Arizal said, the other way around, sorry. When the Arizal passed away, Reb Chaim Vital, who was his student, quoted this pasuk and interpreted it as follows: "V'chiyeh beish," if there should be a person, chet mishpat maves. He says the word chet in other places in the Torah actually means a lack. So if there's a person who lacks a reason to die, they've done nothing wrong, they don't have a reason to die, they're a perfect human being. V'solisa oisoy al eitz, then you blame the eitz. You blame the eitz hada'as, the tree of knowledge. Because of that, Adam and Eve brought death into the world. So there are people who die even if they don't deserve to die. The point is that the word chet, he illustrated, is often used in the Torah to mean a lack. Now, if you come from the previous Mishnah, which says, make sure that you don't forget your learning, you understand why the word chet is appropriate over here. That a person is afraid of chet oy, he's afraid of what will happen if he lacks. So I used to know information, and now I lost that information. Direct continuum from the previous Mishnah, and if a person has that attitude, then chochmasoi miskayemes, the person will be able to sustain their wisdom. On the other hand, on the other hand, any person who has the reverse attitude, which is that chochma, wisdom, precedes yiras chet, the fear of sin, then ein chochmasa miskayemes. In that case, the person's wisdom cannot endure. So there are a number of things we have to understand about this Mishnah. We have to understand, what does yiras chet mean, fear of sin? It's an important definition, so we'll have to talk about that. We'll have to understand why he uses the word koidemes, which is in the present tense. So he doesn't say any person whose fear of sin preceded his wisdom. So we've got to understand why that's in the present tense. We probably also have to address the question of, how does a person come to have fear of sin without wisdom? Surely you have to have some wisdom before you have fear of sin. And then we also have to understand, what does it mean when he says chokhmah? What kind of a wisdom are we talking about over here? There are various kinds of wisdom. Which kind of wisdom would we want a person to sustain? And of course, we always need to know what the specific link is between the content of the Mishnah and the rabbi who's the author. Why is it Dafka Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa who teaches this particular teaching? That's going to be relevant to us as well. So there are various commentaries, as you can well imagine. As we have often, when we're learning the Mishnah, we understand that there are various commentaries, and the various commentaries are going to offer us various insights into what exactly it means. So, by way of introduction, let's start with this. Let's talk about this notion of yiras chet, fear of sin. It's really interesting, because one of the things that we're told will happen before Mashiach comes, there's a famous list. The Gemara in Sanhedrin has a long list of indicators. How do you know that you're living in the Messianic age? And one of them is Yirei Chet Yimasu, that people who fear sin will be despised by the community. Now, let's be honest. I know this is a little bit off topic, but let's be honest for a second. We must be in the time of Mashiach. Yirei Chet, people who fear sin, are disgusted. In other words, you're seen as you live in the dark ages, you're some kind of a radical, you're closed-minded, the world has moved on. If you're afraid of certain behaviors that in today's world are actually trumpeted as ideal and aspirational behaviors of the community. So guess what? The Gemara wasn't so far off apparently about Yirei Chet Imasu, those who fear sin will be despised. However, there's another angle to this as well. It's a very fascinating passage in the Gemara. It extends over a few pages. All of the classical commentaries weigh in on what these indicators are actually supposed to mean. And one of them, the Ben Ish Chai, always takes a positive spin on what they are. So he says, no, Yirei Chet Imasu, you're reading this all wrong. He says, before Mashiach comes, the Jewish community will be in such a good space spiritually, there'll be such an arousal of reconnection to Jewish values that it will be disgusting if a person is still afraid of sinning. How could you be afraid of sinning? There's so much of a community and there's so much learning. What are you afraid of? There's nothing to be afraid of. In any event, what is clear from that Gemara, as from this Mishnah, is that we have to be very distinct in differentiating between Yiras Chet and Yiras Ha'oinesh. The distinction between being fearful of sin or being fearful of consequences. You know, like the classical lightning's going to strike you attitude. That means I'm not afraid of the behavior. I don't see anything fundamentally wrong with the behavior. I'm afraid of what might happen to me. And sadly, this is quite common, where people say, what if I do something wrong and therefore my business is going to fail, therefore, God forbid, my family may have issues that they confront. So we often tend to confuse Yiras Chet with Yiras Ha'onesh, and they're not the same at all. The person who fears sin understands that the sin itself is toxic. The person who fears consequences is just behaving the way that they should because they realize that the long arm of the law is going to get them. So in other words, you get two kinds of people on the road. One kind of person will take a chance through a red light or will go over the speed limit because they don't fear the danger of what happens if, God forbid, I lose control of the car. They're just afraid of the cops. So if they can guarantee themselves that there are no cops in the vicinity, who cares if I speed or if I skip a light? That's Yiras Ha'onesh. Person is only afraid of consequences. Whereas the thinking person understands that there are rules of the road for a reason. And those reasons are actually to protect me. So I'm not afraid of being caught. I'm afraid of the behavior itself. That's the first thing we need to know about Rabbi Chanina's teaching over here. That Yiras Chet has to precede wisdom. That means to say, we're talking over here about Chokhmah. What kind of Chokhmah? What kind of wisdom? Torah wisdom. There's an attitude that a person has to achieve before they actually access the wisdom of Torah. And that is that a person has to shift their perspective from engaging with whatever spiritual practices they do, Torah, mitzvahs, etc., because of what you're going to get or what you may suffer if you do or if you don't. Rather, a person has to first proceed to an understanding that these things are actually bad for me. They're actually bad for me. Now, it's quite interesting because there is a pasuk, Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. Now, there are two ways to read that. Reishis Chochma, the beginning of all wisdom, is Yiras Hashem, fear of God. Or you could read it as Reishis, the precedent before the introduction to Chokhmah, to wisdom, is Yiras Hashem. In other words, what Rabbi Chanina seems to say here is like the second interpretation. The prelude to wisdom is Yiras Hashem. If you want to have true wisdom, real wisdom, Torah wisdom, wisdom as Hashem would want us to have wisdom, then what you require is Yiras Hashem. You have to have fear of God. So he's telling us it's a prelude. However, some of the Meforshim point out that actually you could say Reishis Chochmah, the first wisdom that you'll ever have, is the wisdom to know Yiras Chet, the wisdom to know to be afraid of sin. If that is your first wisdom, you have a healthy foundation, and on that healthy foundation, you can continue to build and you will have a sustainable structure of chokhmah, of real insight and real wisdom. Now, the word koidemes is in the present tense, right? It's not just once upon a time when you were young and you started your path and you first looked to gather wisdom. That's when you had to have yiras chet. That's true. But a person should never think that it's a one-off wonder. Once upon a time, I had yiras chet and then I went down the journey of study. No, koidemes. This is an ongoing process every single day. As I go through the journey today of learning today and trying to expand my wisdom and sustain my wisdom today, I need to remind myself afresh today, yiras chet, to have awareness of sin and fear of sin. Now, what happens over here, something interesting happens. Because effectively, we're talking about two different ways, and a number of the Mefarshim will bring this in a tapestry of like different perspectives on the same kind of a message. There are different ways in which a person can develop their wisdom. We're what the Torah calls Am Chacham V'Novain. We're a wise, insightful nation. We hold wisdom at a premium. That's why they call us the people of the book. That's why we're so innovative. That's why we're always learning. That's why we ask so many questions. Because for us, wisdom is an incredible asset. Sometimes that could work against us. Ironically, it's very often the case that a person's greatest asset is sometimes their Achilles heel. Take, for example, the person who's really kind and tolerant and generous. That's the person who runs the greatest risk of being abused by other people. Because you're so kind and because you're so tolerant. So your greatest strength is potentially also your greatest weakness. Because we as Jewish people, we put a premium on wisdom. We care so much about wisdom. We want to pursue wisdom. We want to learn wisdom. So wisdom potentially could be our Achilles heel. And it has happened to us in the course of our history before. The question Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa challenges us with is, why do you want wisdom? What's driving you towards that wisdom? Because there are two options. The one is chochmasoi kodemes. What drives you to wisdom? Wisdom. That's what I want. I want to be smart. I want to be wise. I want to know what everybody has to say from all the different disciplines, the sciences and the philosophies and so on. And different approaches. Why do you need to have wisdom? To connect to Hashem. Yiras chet. I have to have wisdom in order to know how I should be a decent, genuine human being who is going to, behave the way that I should. Like we say in our davening. Soif maaseh b'machshava techila. That the way things pan out in action is always an indicator of where they started in thought. So that's what Rabbi Hanina is telling us over here. Depending on which approach you're choosing, if you're looking for chokhmah as the objective, or if you're looking for yiras chet as the objective, if that's how you start the process, if that's your launch pad, if that's your foundation, the outcome at the end is going to look quite different. So, let's say that the purpose of learning, in a person's mind, the purpose of learning is because they want information. They want to be smart. They want everybody to recognize their great intellectual abilities. Ein chochmosoi miskayemes. That kind of wisdom is not going to endure. Fascinating, because you'd think it would. I have an ambition. I follow my ambition. I'm driven in that direction. You'd expect that it's going to endure. So Rabbi Hanina says, because there's something else about being Jewish that not everybody is so quick to acknowledge. Yes, of course we enjoy wisdom, and we prioritize and we love wisdom. We put it on a pedestal. That's true. Yet at the same time, our relationship with Hashem is something that we don't even get to control. But it's there. It's intrinsic. So this need for yiras chet, this need to be fearful of what might disrupt my relationship to Hashem, is inherent, whether I like it or not. So, if my goal is that I want to do what? To gather as much wisdom as possible, what's going to happen at some point is the yiras chet, the true self of who I am, is going to feel a little bit empty. My connection to Hashem is going to lag a little bit. Ein chochmosoi miskayemes. You know what's going to happen? I'm going to learn things along the way that clash with my innate sense of what Judaism is all about and what's important about my connection to Hashem. There's going to be a conflict over there, and one of the two is going to have to give. Either the chokhmah or the yiras chet. Guess what? Ein chokhmosai miskayemes. I'll be dissatisfied with the wisdom that I've collated, and therefore the wisdom itself is not going to survive. Or to put it into slightly different words, maybe a little bit more of like a summary of it, the Rambam says that if a person prioritizes wisdom over virtue, yiras chet is virtue, right? It's the type of human being you're going to be. So if a person prioritizes intellect over virtue, then the intellect doesn't last, because virtue is a deeper human need. If a person prioritizes virtue over wisdom, then the wisdom will, in fact, endure and continue. One of the beautiful commentators on the Chumash, the Seforno, says an interesting thing. He says, at the end of the day, people are interesting, right? And people are biased, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. We have our innate biases. And so one of the most dangerous things that a person could ever do, and we have so much evidence of this in history generally and in modern history specifically, and I'd go so far as to say in current history mostly, contemporary experiences mostly, what the Seforno says from this Mishnah should be required reading for every human on the planet. He says the bias of people is that when a person looks for chokhmah, and wants to base their morality on their chokhmah, it's open season. Anybody can justify anything using whatever mental gymnastics they happen to choose. So just to make it like really contemporary, there was that ridiculous comment that was doing the rounds on social media yesterday from this big rally that happened somewhere in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And the guy gets up and he says in this public forum that if Israel would stop shooting missiles at Gaza, anti-Semitism would stop. In other words, can you imagine this convoluted logic that suggests that anti-Semitism is the fault of the Jews? Truth is, it's nothing new. It's a page straight out of Google's playbook, which in turn goes straight back to Pirkei himself, the first arch anti-Semite. So it's nothing new to us. But that's what the Seforno says. The moment people use their wisdom to define their morality, we're in bad shape. We're all in danger. Because people are capable of losing that wisdom along the way and then still claiming that they have a moral compass. That, he says, is what Rabbi Hanina wants to teach us. If the foundation of the pursuit of wisdom is that I have a morality that is beyond my choice and beyond my understanding, it's yiras chet, it was defined by Hashem, and I have to be afraid of stepping out of line, then chokhmosoi miskayemes. Then your morality, the wisdom that you have, will be long-term, and it will be an enduring kind of wisdom. Whereas if your pursuit is wisdom, not only will your morality not endure, but the wisdom itself will become idiocy, as happens. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the world that we live in right now is Exhibit A. You don't have to look very far to see where this has landed us. There's another a similar kind of an angle on it, and that is this. We have a principle in Judaism. We read it in the parasha this past Shabbos. Ein adam choite, or actually the expression is Ein adam oiver aveira. A person would never sin. Ela im kein nichnas boi ruach shtus. If not for the fact that some insanity temporarily crept into the person's mind. So basically, temporary insanity would never be an excuse in Judaism, because in Judaism, every crime is temporary insanity, and yet it's still punishable. So that tells you something. That tells you what is an Aveira. We already described that Aveira means crossing over. A person has an opportunity to connect to Hashem, and instead they've chosen to distance themselves from Hashem. Over here we're using the lighter expression chet, but it's the same principle. So if a person is connected to Hashem, naturally they will be connected to true wisdom. And if a person is disconnected from Hashem, all of the wisdom that they try to garner from the entire world is not guaranteed to protect them from foolishness. So, kol sheyiras chetoi, a person who fears sin, in other words, fears the distance from Hashem, never wants to be separated from Hashem. If that is the prelude to your learning on a daily basis, chachmosoi miskayemes, then you'll never fall into the trap of foolishness, which is so rife in the world. But if it's all, but if it's all about just simply the wisdom can fall to pieces at any time. That's why it's quite interesting to note that the Gemara says, when the Torah tells us, uledavka boy, that you have a mitzvah to cleave to Hashem, says the Gemara, how could you cleave to Hashem? Isn't Hashem eish oichla? Isn't Hashem an all-consuming fire? How could you possibly cleave to Hashem? So what's the suggestion that the Gemara gives? Hidavek b'talmidei chachamim. Attach yourself to those people who have tremendous Torah wisdom. There you have it. Kol shiras chetoi, any person who is afraid that they don't want to land up in a situation where they're not connected to Hashem. In other words, they want to remain connected to Hashem. What do? Then you'll go to the right sources of wisdom, and then chachmasoi miskayemes, your wisdom will endure. It does remind me of, I'm sure many of you remember the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, and how it sent these ripples through the community because I don't remember the guy's name offhand, but the perpetrator, the attempted assassin, didn't fit the profile. He didn't come from a broken home or an impoverished background, or he wasn't radicalized. By the way, you see this quite often in Islamic fundamentalism. Very often, the suicide bomber is himself not necessarily from an impoverished background or even a radicalized individual. It's fascinating. So at the time the Rebbe spoke about it and said, this is evidence to the fact that what's lacking in our society is not that people should have the things that they believe that they need and then they'll be good human beings. What they lack is an awareness of a higher authority. If you don't feel that you're answerable to a higher authority, then ein chochmasoi miskayemes. Then all the wisdom in the world is not necessarily going to endure, and a person could land up behaving in the most horrific kind of ways, as unfortunately, we see again and again in our history. Now, how do you get yiras chet? That's the real question. It's nice as a theory. So we had the previous Mishnah tell us, don't forget your Torah learning. We said, okay, how do you ensure that you don't forget your Torah learning? Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa says, well, the way to that is make sure that yiras chet, fear of sin, precedes the actual learning. Okay, so how do I get yiras chet? And what is this to do with Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa? So, as is very frequently the case in Pirkei Avos, knowing who the author is gives us the greatest insight into understanding what it is that he wants to convey to us. The reason why we don't have too many teachings of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa across the entire Talmud is because his primary way of serving Hashem was through prayer. Now, we already touched on that, right? We saw he could pray for vinegar to burn, and it did. He could pray for it to stop or start raining, and it did. And he could even pray for heaven to change the rules of spiritual engagement and take a gift back. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's superpower was prayer. That's why he's the one to tell us, yes, of course, learning Torah is incredibly important, and we all have to engage in learning Torah, but we have to realize simultaneously that our dedication to Hashem cannot happen on one channel alone. It's kind of like the table in the dream. If you don't have all the legs, the table is not stable. We already know from the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avos, the second Mishnah, that the world stands on three things. Torah, avodah, gemilus chasadim. Torah study, service of Hashem, which in the old days was through sacrifices and today is through prayer, and the gemilus chasadim, acts of kindness. But the truth is that out of all of those, we understand that there's a distinction between kindness and the other two. Kindness is very much about you and other people. Torah and davening, that's your personal spiritual growth. And they're both more in the spiritual arena. And they balance each other very healthily. So if I don't have that balance, not only am I not a Jewish person as a Jewish person should be, but even the chokhmah, wisdom that I want to acquire could also deteriorate over time. And that's what Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa wants to show us. What happens when a person learns Torah? Well, the goal of Torah is, and not everybody achieves it, the goal of Torah is for a person to be open enough to allow Hashem's wisdom to flow into their mind. That's what Torah offers us. The opportunity to be open enough that Hashem's wisdom can populate my mind, and that becomes how I think. And that's why we use the expression, HaTorah nikras al shmoi, that if a person is dedicated enough in their Torah learning, eventually the Torah learning is actually attributed to the individual, even though it's not my wisdom, it's Hashem's wisdom. But that's how it works, that I open myself up and absorb Hashem's wisdom to such an extent that it becomes almost like it's mine. Now, what's the danger of Torah learning, unfortunately, is that very often when people learn Torah, they start to feel, wow, look how clever I am. Look how much I've learned. And then you start with like the Daf reference Olympics, How many places can I quote the exact place where it came from? Which is all very nice, and it shows that a person is erudite, but it could easily tinge the learning with a sense of arrogance. And that's really, really unhealthy. So we need something else that balances us. And that's where davening comes into the picture. In fact, the directional experience of Torah learning and of davening is opposite. Torah learning is, there's Torah up there, and it has to come down into my reality. The Gemara says, why is Torah compared to water? Because Torah will always flow, water will always flow from the higher to the lower, and likewise, Torah will always find the most humble people. That's where it will flow. Davening is compared to fire. And that's one of the reasons, incidentally, I think, that we naturally move so much when we daven, because the soul is compared to a candle, and just like the flickering flame of the candle, so that's us when we daven. We're agitated. We're trying to move and transcend the here and now to be able to connect to Hashem. In fact, the word tefillah is related to the word tofel, which means to weld things together, to connect things together. So davening, which was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa's primary focus, prayer, that is the part of ourselves that causes connection. That is the part of ourselves that ensures yiras chet, that I appreciate that what I need to avoid at all costs is disconnection from Hashem. What is davening? To try to connect to Hashem. Tefillah from the word tofel, to connect to Hashem. And that's what Rabbi Hanina wants to tell us. Every single day of our lives. That's why it's in the present tense. Any person whose davening is the prelude to their learning, they don't just knock it off so that they could have the satisfaction of sitting down and sinking their teeth, obviously conceptually, into a juicy piece of Gemara. But you realize that davening is what frames the day. It's what directs the focus. If the standard of how a person proceeds in their daily experience is to sink themselves into their davening and have a meaningful experience which makes real to them the sense of wanting to connect to Hashem and the fear of chet, of anything that might disrupt that connection, then chochmosoi miskayemes, the Torah learning that one does during the course of the day, is sustainable. Not just that you remember the information, but like the Tanakh tells us about King David, V'Hashem imoy, Hashem was always with him, and the Gemara says what that means is halacha kamoisoi, that he was always able to come up with the correct understanding of what the halacha should be. The correct understanding of Torah. Chachmosoi miskayemes, the person's Torah endures. But if a person's priority is to sit down and learn, and davening is just like a little bit of a sidebar, and it doesn't really get the attention that it should, the impact is not just on the spiritual elation that you might feel through davening, but ein chachmasoi miskayemes, the person's learning itself may not endure. So that's a very practical take-home lesson for us, the importance of focused prayer, which unfortunately very often is a little bit overlooked.